Less than 10% of Americans wait until age 70 to claim Social Security benefits. In some data sets, that number drops as low as 4%. And if you've spent any time reading about retirement, you've probably seen the headlines. Americans are ignoring the smartest move in retirement planning. 90% are making a costly mistake. The experts agree, and almost nobody is listening. But here's the thing about that framing. It sounds like a behavioral problem, like millions of people simply don't understand the math or don't care enough to act on it. And if that were true, the solution would be simple. Just educate people better and watch the numbers shift. Except the numbers tell a completely different story when you look at who is actually claiming early and why. Because for most Americans, this isn't a knowledge gap, it's a constraint. And those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. By the end of this video, you're going to understand the real math behind this decision, the numbers that actually matter, the scenarios where waiting genuinely pays off, and the scenarios where waiting can make your entire retirement plan more vulnerable, not less. And most importantly, you're going to know the questions that lead to the right answer for your specific situation, because there is no universal right answer here. And the advice that assumes there is might be the most expensive mistake in the conversation. Start with this number, 42%. That's the share of older Americans who depend on Social Security for at least half of their retirement income, and 14% rely on it for 90% or more of what they live on, not as a supplement, as the foundation, the thing the entire plan is built around. For those households, the decision of when to claim isn't an optimization exercise. It's the difference between a plan that works and one that doesn't. And the stakes attached to getting it wrong run in both directions. Claim too early and you lock in a permanently reduced benefit for life. Claim too late and you put impossible pressure on resources that simply aren't there to cover the gap. Now here's the part that almost never makes it into the headlines. According to the Employee Benefit Research Institute, most workers who retire earlier than they planned say the timing was outside their control. A health problem, a job that disappeared, a family member who needed care. The median actual retirement age in the United States is 62, the earliest possible age to claim Social Security. And surveys consistently show that Americans expect to retire around 65. That 3-year gap between expectation and reality isn't laziness or poor planning. It's life. So when a headline says 90% of Americans are ignoring the smartest Social Security strategy, what it's really describing for a large portion of that 90% is people making the only realistic decision available to them given what they actually have and what their lives actually look like. That's not a failure of financial literacy. That's a constraint problem being mislabeled as a behavioral one. And understanding that distinction is what makes the rest of this conversation actually useful. Let's start with the numbers, because they're genuinely striking. If your full retirement age benefit is $2,000 a month, claim at 62 and that drops to roughly $1,400. Wait until 70 and it climbs to approximately $2,480. That's a difference of over $1,000 every single month for the rest of your life, guaranteed, adjusted for inflation. Between ages 67 and 70 specifically, benefits grow at 8% per year. That's not a market return. That's not a projection. It's built into the structure of Social Security itself, one of the few guaranteed income increases that exists in retirement planning. The break-even point between claiming at 62 versus waiting until 70 lands at approximately age 80 to 81. Before that age, the person who claimed early has collected more total dollars. After it, the person who waited pulls ahead and continues pulling ahead for every additional year of life. Given that men who reach 65 live to roughly 83 or 84 on average, and women to 85 or 86, the math favors waiting for most people who make it to that age. But here's where it gets more complicated, and this is the part that most of the headlines skip entirely. Delaying only works if you can afford to fund the gap, the period between when you stop working and when you turn on your Social Security income. And for a lot of Americans, that gap is the problem. Here's a concrete example. Say you retire at 62 with a $350,000 portfolio and you need $40,000 a year to live on. If you delay Social Security until 70, your entire $40,000 annual need comes from that portfolio for 8 straight years. That's an 11 to 12% annual withdrawal rate. Not just high, but in the range where sequence of returns risk becomes genuinely dangerous. If markets drop early in that window and you're pulling out large amounts simultaneously, you're locking in losses at the worst possible moment. Even with reasonable market cooperation, that portfolio could shrink from $350,000 to somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 by the time your higher benefit kicks in. Now flip the scenario. You claim at 62 with a benefit of $1,500 a month, $18,000 a year. Suddenly, you only need $22,000 from your portfolio instead of $40,000. That's a withdrawal rate around 6%. Still elevated, but manageable with a flexible strategy. Your portfolio has more room to breathe, more time to recover from downturns, and a meaningfully higher chance of lasting as long as you need it to. You gave up the larger monthly check, but you protected the foundation underneath it. And in that specific situation, that trade can produce a more sustainable retirement than the one the headlines say you should be building. So when does delaying actually make sense? If you're likely to live a long time, strong family history, good health, especially if you're a woman given longer average life expectancy, the math increasingly favors waiting. Every year past 80 that you live, the decision to delay pays larger dividends. If you're the higher earner in a married couple, this decision carries even more weight, because the benefit you lock in doesn't just affect you, it becomes the survivor benefit, the income your spouse will live on if you die first. That changes the calculation significantly. If you have a substantial portfolio and can genuinely cover the gap without taking on dangerous withdrawal rates, delaying converts part of that portfolio into guaranteed inflation-protected income. Research from Dr. Wade Pfau and David Blanchett shows this can actually increase your safe withdrawal rate and extend how long your portfolio lasts, but only when the gap is funded sustainably. And on the other side, if your health suggests a shorter life expectancy, if you have modest savings with no real way to bridge the gap, if retirement came earlier than you planned, and your portfolio simply can't absorb 8 years of heavy withdrawals, the case for claiming early isn't a mistake. It's a rational response to a real situation. Here's the question that cuts through all of it, the one most people never actually ask themselves before making this decision. What problem am I trying to solve? Maximize total lifetime income? Delay helps. Protect a surviving spouse? Delay helps, especially for the higher earner. Reduce pressure on a modest portfolio right now? Claiming early might be the move that makes everything else work. Cover basic expenses without depleting what you've saved? Same answer. The math behind waiting is real and it's powerful, but it was built for a specific set of assumptions, that you're working, or that you have assets to cover the gap. For the majority of Americans who don't have that flexibility, the advice isn't wrong. It just doesn't apply to them, and nobody tells them that. Here's what I want you to sit with. Every piece of advice that says wait until 70 is built on a foundation of assumptions, that you're still working or close to it, that you have a portfolio substantial enough to cover several years of living expenses without touching Social Security, that your health gives you reasonable confidence you'll live past the break-even point, that your life cooperated with your plan. Those assumptions aren't unreasonable. For some people, they're completely accurate. But for the majority of Americans, people with modest savings, people whose retirement arrived earlier than expected, people whose bodies or circumstances made the decision for them, those assumptions describe someone else's life. And advice built on someone else's life isn't advice. It's a template that doesn't fit. This is the thing that changes when you actually understand Social Security rather than just following what sounds authoritative. You stop looking for the right age, you start looking for the right questions. What does my portfolio actually look like? And what withdrawal rate am I comfortable sustaining? What does my health history suggest about longevity? Am I part of a couple where the survivor benefit changes the math significantly? Do I have the flexibility to bridge the gap? Or would trying to do so put more pressure on my plan than the higher benefit is worth? None of those questions have universal answers. And that's not a problem. That's the point. Because Social Security isn't a one-size-fits-all system, even though it gets described that way constantly. It's a set of levers that interact differently depending on income, health, savings, marital status, and a dozen other variables that are specific to your household and nobody else's. The people who retire well aren't necessarily the ones who followed the most popular advice. They're the ones who understood what the advice was actually built for, and honestly assessed whether that description fit them. Waiting until 70 can be one of the most powerful financial moves available in retirement. Claiming at 62 can be the decision that keeps an entire plan from collapsing. Both of those things are true. And knowing which one applies to you is worth more than any headline about what 90% of Americans are supposedly getting wrong. So, here's what to take forward from everything covered today. The headline said 90% of Americans are ignoring the best Social Security strategy. But what the data actually shows is something more honest and more complicated. Most people aren't ignoring good advice. They're navigating real constraints, modest portfolios, health that didn't cooperate, careers that ended earlier than planned, spouses who depend on the decision going a specific way. And for a meaningful portion of that 90%, claiming early isn't a mistake. It's the move that holds everything else together. The 8% annual growth between 67 and 70 is real. The break-even math is real. The survivor benefit logic is real. None of that disappears, but it only translates into a better outcome when the assumptions underneath it actually match your situation. And most of the advice you'll encounter never tells you what those assumptions are. What this video gave you isn't a number, it's a framework. The ability to look at your own situation, your savings, your health, your household, your actual retirement timeline, and ask the questions that produce a decision built for your life rather than a statistical average of everyone else's. Because the goal of Social Security was never to reward the people who waited the longest. It was to provide income security in retirement. And income security looks different for a 62-year-old with a $350,000 portfolio and a health scare than it does for a 68-year-old with $1 million portfolio and a family history of living into their 90s. Same program, completely different optimal strategy. The right age to claim Social Security isn't 62. It isn't 70. It's the age that fits the plan you actually have, not the one the headlines assumed you had. If this reframed something you thought you already understood, pass it on to someone who's facing this decision right now. And subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of nuance we bring every single week.